Good morning, George Hepworth, Grover Park Consulting. I recently built the Lander Trail Foundation, an online searchable database application using PowerApps for the interface and SQL Server for the backend. In the process, I, again, was able to expand my knowledge and understanding of how PowerApps work, but I also was reminded of some of its weaknesses. And in today's video, I'd like to address one of those weaknesses and how I figured out a method to overcome that particular weakness, at least in part. Let me explain. As you can no doubt tell from the screen, I'm talking about the ability to reuse code. As Access developers, reusable code is part of our toolkit. We can write a standalone module, create functions or subs in that module, and then call that code from anywhere in the application where we need that particular functionality. It can be reused over and over in many different places. PowerApps doesn't work the same way, at least not natively. If you want the same functionality on two different screens, you basically have to copy and paste that functionality into the onSelect or onChange event of controls on both screens. PowerApps do have a feature called components, which are basically encapsulated objects, which you can write code inside that component and then drop that component onto multiple screens. I tried that out in one app, found that it does work. It's workable, usable, but it was not the most, shall we say, user-friendly approach from my point of view, and I didn't persist in using them, and I continued to look for a way to reuse code. Finally, doing internet, just reading and looking at blogs and looking at videos and reading articles, I finally ran across a technique which I think is the solution, at least for my apps, in addressing the problem of reusable code. It's not a native functionality. It's a way to use native components in a way that does address the need to use the code in multiple places. Let's look at how that might work. We're in the development environment for PowerApps in my 365 account, looking at the Lander Trail Foundation library application. In order to support this reusable code function, the first step was to create a new separate screen on which I could put toggles. These toggles control the use of reusable code. I'll show you this one, which is called Patch Publications. Its purpose is to add or update publication information. Optionally, depending on where we are in the application, again, this is reusable code, so it's called from, in this case, 2 places, but it could be called from 3 or 4 or 5 different screens in a much larger application. Depending on where it's called from, we may either add a book and assign authors to that book, or just simply add a new book. We have to use toggles, and I'll explain the reason for that later. We use the onChange event of each toggle to run our code. This is the code involved. It is now set up so that it will accept global variables rather than reference specific controls on a specific screen. For example, publication title comes from a global variable called gvar publication title. The volume, the number of volumes, all the other features that we want to capture about publications are available as global variables. In a VBA function, these would be arguments passed into a function. If you stop and think about it, the logic is very similar. We create a global variable called publication title, and then we can use that variable anywhere we want throughout the application. In a function, of course, it's restricted to that specific function, but the logic between the two places is the same. When the new publication has been added, or an existing publication has been updated, we run two stored procedures. These are called by flows. One of the flows is the create pub sort LTF books. We use the .run method of that flow to pass in the publication ID of the book we just updated here. Then we assign one or more authors to that book using this stored procedure called by this flow. We pass it a JSON file containing one or more author names, and again we pass it the primary key, the publication ID for the book which was just updated or added. How do we know whether we're adding or updating a book? The conditional here tells us if this is a new book, it's not an existing book, gvar book will be blank, then we use the defaults method to add a book. If gvar book is an existing book, we give it the publication ID or the primary key for that publication and filter our table to impact just that one book, in which case we're updating it with the new values passed in. If you think about that for just a minute, you can see there are some similarities, at least at the logic level, between a function and the reusable code here. The return value from a function is the logical equivalent to this set variable. gvar updated book is, in a logical sense, the equivalent of the return value from a function, and we can use that return value here and here. After we have run our function, we're going to refresh the publication table so that PowerApps now has all of the existing records with all of their current values. We refresh the publication creator table, which is where we link publications to authors. We refresh the creator table so that all of our authors are updated. And we refresh this view, which returns our publications sorted alphabetically. How do we invoke it? Let's look at how we do that. Again, this is going to run on the change event of this toggle. How does the toggle know when to run? It has a default value equal to a global variable, which is gvar book update. When the value of gvar book update changes anywhere in the application, on screen 1, screen 2, screen 3, the value changes here, and that in turn triggers the onChange event for that toggle. That's the mechanism we use to make our code reusable. Now, let's go look at two places where we call this code. The first is from the Edit Publication screen. Actually, let's start here so you can see how it actually works altogether. This icon, the plus sign, tells our app that we want to add a new book. Let's run it. Click here. Now we're looking at the edit screen with all of our controls blanked out. When we add a new book and click the Save button, we're going to make some changes to global variables, which will force that toggle button to update itself using the onChange event. Before I actually do that, let's see how that works. Take it out of run, look at the onSave. The first thing we do is set that gvar book value to either a blank or the value of an existing publication. I just showed you that the patch command uses this variable to decide whether it's going to update an existing book or create a new book. The next step is to prepare all of the other global variables our patch command needs to update or add the publication title. That's going to come from an input field. on the form, the volume, and again, we will either capture an existing volume or add a new one, or we use the default value. Default, I think, is 1. The default value for number of volumes is also 1. So as we step through each of these set commands, we create global variables or reset the values of global variables, as the case may be, to either the value in a control on this screen or to blank. This allows us to bypass fields that we're not ready to enter, the year it's published, and so on. Once we've set the values for each of our variables, our global variables, we toggle the value of this book update variable from true to false or false to true. That changes the value, which is set as the default in our toggle. When it changes, the default value in the toggle updates, triggering the onChange event. The final step, the final piece, is to place on this screen a hidden control which returns the value, the current value in the toggle. I have a hard time explaining this without getting into circular definitions, so I'm just going to tell you what happens and let you figure it out. Putting this control on this screen, where we're also toggling the value of the global variable from true to false, means that the onChange event in that toggle fires whenever this variable is changed. If we don't put this control on this screen to pull that value back, the onChange event of that toggle will not fire until we actually navigate to the screen where it is. By referring to its value here, we're able to cause that onChange event to run as soon as we change the value of that global variable here. We're ready now to go ahead and add this new book. We'll click the Save button. That toggles the value of the variable from false to true or true to false, which in turn causes the toggle to run its code, which adds the new book. And now we're looking at that book as one of the books in our catalog. Let's look at a different place where we call the same code. This screen is where we use the Google Books API. Same code is going to run here as on the first screen we looked at. Before I put a title in and run it, let's take a quick look at that. Take it out of run mode, look at the add button. It does many of the same things we just looked at, plus some additional steps, because we're using the Google Books API to bring back more information. For example, we're preparing a JSON file with just the book authors retrieved from Google Books. The JSON file we get back from Google includes a segment for the book authors, which we then clean up, bring out, prepare for our own JSON use in a stored procedure in SQL Server. We decide if we're going to add a cover photo or are going to use the Google Books supplied cover photo. We always set gvar book to blank because we're only going to add new books through this screen. So gvar book will always be passed without a value for a book. You see the same series of commands to set up our variables, which will act as the input arguments. We get down to this point and we toggle our book update variable, firing the code in the toggle, inserting this new book into the books table. And as before, we have a hidden field which references the toggle to patch the publications, which adds or updates publications, referring to its value, to force the update to occur while we're still on this screen. Now, you wouldn't really have to put it on a separate screen the way I consolidated it here, but it seems a lot cleaner to me to keep a separate screen. To recap, we need three primary components. One is the toggle button itself, the default value set to the value of a global variable, the code that runs on change event of that toggle. In the screen where we want to reuse that code, we toggle the value of that variable from true to false or false to true, and we have the final piece, which is the hidden control referring to the value of this toggle button, which causes that event to occur while we're still on that calling screen. There are other things we can do here. I'm reusing this function for authors. These are collections of authors, various collections of authors, which can run from one or more places in our app. As I find other places where I want to reuse code that I've already written, I will add a toggle button, add the variable and the hidden control on the appropriate screen, consolidating as much of my code as possible into one place. Clearly not the equivalent of a standalone module in VBA. However, logically the concept is very similar, and it accomplishes the same end goal, which is to place code which can be used in more than one place in a single location where updating it is simpler and quicker than if we have to search throughout the entire application to find it. If you like what you have seen, if you are interested in seeing more of these videos, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.